three kind of basic approaches here, I think, for getting information into long-term memory. And as I say, I talked on the previous about the elaborative encoding and the active and spaced repetition. I am focusing a bit more in this talk on the active and spaced repetition side of things. Although, as I'll come to say later, they are linked. The elaborative encoding and the active and spaced repetition are linked. It's not that they are completely separate, but I am focusing a bit more on the active and spaced repetition. And the problem I'm really trying to address here, the problem I'm really trying to solve, is that problem of you've got students, you've taught them something, you know from your formative assessment and your checking and your end of lesson assessment, you know that the students have understood it in that lesson, but you just have the experience where they come back a couple of days, a week later, and they've forgotten, if not all of it, quite a lot of it. That's the issue I'm trying to address. And that is the issue I certainly encountered as a teacher. I talked to maths teachers in particular. I was an English teacher, but I talked to maths teachers in particular who faced this. I was talking to a maths teacher recently who said particularly simultaneous equations. They found that again and again, that they would get to a lesson, the student would be able to do the simultaneous equation, but then they move on. When they come back the next lesson, they've just forgotten so much of what they really did have in the previous lesson. So that's the kind of problem I want to try and solve here. And it's a problem, as I say, that I think every teacher will have encountered with students, but it isn't just a problem you encounter with students, it's a problem that we face as adults. And I think the most common example of how you face this as an adult is maybe you read a book, you really like the book, say a non-fiction book, and it's got a message in it and it's got some really interesting insights, and you read it and you like it and you enjoy it, and you've got a memory of enjoying it and having read it, but perhaps a year later you have very little recollection of actually the details of what was in it. And I certainly find that all the time, that there can be books you enjoy and understand and have that understanding in the moment, but they drain away. And I think that's a problem, because I've certainly encountered the situation where a book I've read a few years ago, there's been something in it that would have been really useful a few years later, and because I've forgotten it, I haven't been able to apply that insight. And then I'll come across the insight again and think, oh, how frustrating, if only I'd remembered it, that would have saved me a lot of time. So this is something that affects students, but it affects adults as well. So that's the kind of main problem I'm dealing, the problem of you've understood something, but how do you hold it? How do you stop it draining away? So in terms of doing this in the classroom, here are my three first things to start with. So first of all, we're starting here with material students already understood. So that's the point I'm making. We're starting with material that you've taught, they've understood, but you're very worried that they're going to forget it. So the second step is you want to turn this content that the students have understood into flashcards that are as follows: simple, numerous, overlapping. And then the third thing is you want to revise this content, you want your students to revise this content using a spaced repetition flashcard app. So those are the three first basic steps. And I am going to talk you through those in a little bit more detail. So start with material your students have understood. I'm just going to illustrate this using a little bit of information about Shakespeare. So this is just illustrative. This is just a way of a kind of a worked example of what I'm talking about. Let's suppose this is the information you want your students to understand and remember. And this could be something, you might be teaching this across a 6-week unit in year 4. You might be teaching it in one lesson in year 12. But this might be some information that in a wider Shakespeare unit, you want your students to retain. And you want them to retain it, not just for next week, not just for next month, but if you're a secondary teacher, you're teaching this in year 7, you want your students to retain this when they're doing Shakespeare at GCSE, you want them to retain it when they've left school. This is interesting information, it's useful information, it's valuable information. This is going to help them as they go forward, they'll be able to build on this. And again, if you've taught this in year 7 and they've remembered it, in year 8, you can then build on it and teach some information that builds on it. Whereas if they've forgotten it, you've got to reteach it again, and you're just you're not able to build. So that's the kind of basic information. And as I say, there'd be a variety of different ways you teach that depending on the phase, the year, how you would bring that alive and make sure students that it has meaning. And then your next thing then would be, right, so you need to turn this content into flashcards that are, first of all, simple. So actually, if I just go back to that previous flashcard, don't have a flashcard with a large chunk of information on it like that. So this is actually, yes, this is the content you want to learn, but this is a bad flashcard. It has too much information on it. And so it's not clear for students testing themselves on that, if they're doing the active recall, how they would know if they've got it right or wrong. There's just too much information on there. So what you want to do is you want to break up all of the content that's there. You want to break it up into something smaller and simpler. So you're breaking it up. There you go. There's one example of a really simple flashcard question. Now, obviously, the response people then have is, oh, yeah, that's so atomized. That's so small. It's just such a trivial bit of information. That's not what Shakespeare's all about. And you're right, it's not. But what I'm saying here is we're taking really big bits of information that are complex and unwieldy, and we're breaking them down into little bits. And obviously, the next step, as I say, it's not just about making them simple. It's about making them numerous. So you haven't just got one flashcard. You've got several. Okay? So rather than having one flashcard with loads of stuff on it, you have several flashcards, and each one is just a little bit. And those are some examples there. And then the next thing you want to do is make them overlapping. And so what do I mean by overlapping? A really obvious example of this is with foreign language vocabulary. That with foreign language vocabulary, you want to have the English word into the foreign language, and then you want to have the foreign language word also into English. That you want to be able to practice making the translation both ways. And so you want to turn the content into flashcards, therefore, that are overlapping. So my example here with Shakespeare would be, you're not just asking when did William Shakespeare live, but you can also say which famous playwright lived from then. So you're getting practice at thinking about the question in both ways. And the thing about that is you're trying to build a sort of flexible knowledge. So it's just not just knowledge that can only work in one way. You're building something that's a bit more flexible. So a couple of other examples of those there as well. And as I say, that's just trying to get that flexibility and get students to be thinking about things that they can also, you're building up the cues that they have for retrieving things from long-term memory. So if they're reading an article and it's talking about the Bard of Avon, that they're used to thinking, Bard of Avon, William Shakespeare, that they've got that cue in there straight away. And what you really are trying to build is a schema. You're trying to build this kind of Shakespeare schema in your students' long-term memory, that when they're hearing the word Shakespeare, it is promoting all of these kinds of associations and thoughts. And similarly, when they're hearing Romeo and Juliet, that's triggering another set of associations of which Shakespeare is a part. And you can see, I've just made this, I've just put in a few things that from when I taught Shakespeare I felt were important. Even sort of silly little things like Jacobean. I always found that was sometimes a bit of a stumbling block for students, that they'd be reading something, they understood about, if we're doing Macbeth, they'd understand about James I, understand about Shakespeare, but Jacobean, hang on, what does that mean? And so even just knowing that, it's stopping a kind of block that might happen when they're reading something, something that might, as I say, really sort of, they'll stumble on and will stop them understanding the wider meaning. So that's what you're trying to build up. And the hope would be that over time, a primary or secondary, sixth form, all of them together, you're building the richness of that schema and you're adding to it all the time, and the schema is getting richer and richer and more powerful. Okay, so that's the bit about creating the flashcards. The next thing is, as I say, is, well, how are you going to get students to remember these and to not have this forgetting curve problem? So the next thing we need to do is we need to revise in such a way that we're going to interrupt this forgetting curve. So let's just remind ourselves of the forgetting curve. We saw that on a previous slide. That's a forgetting curve. And as I said before, that data is from Ebbinghouse's original experiment. Now, what you want to try and do now is to interrupt this forgetting curve. So this blue line here is from Ebbinghouse's original data. What I'm going to show you now is actually data I've laid on top of this. This is not from Ebbinghouse's original data, but this is kind of taken from other research showing how you can interrupt this forgetting curve and how you can build memory. So what you want to do is, after 20 minutes, you've learned all your Shakespeare stuff. After 20 minutes, you want to interrupt that forgetting curve by revising what you've just learned. So after 20 minutes, you revise it and you top it up. So it's after 20 minutes, it's decayed down to kind of 60%, but you revise it and so it's perfect again. You top up to 100%. And then what's great is that it will start to decay again. So the memory will start to decay again, but it will decay at a slightly kind of slower rate. And that might be a little bit tricky to spot on this graph. It's a log scale, but essentially it's just not decaying as fast as it would have done if it had just been sort of one repetition. And then what you do is you then follow up again. Let's do another repetition. Let's do our review the next time. It was an hour. So let's come back and review, top up to 100%. And again, the decay, you've just slightly slowed down the decay again. And then let's come back after 9 hours. Let's come back after 24. And every time you're reviewing it, it's not just that you're topping it up to 100%. It's that you're slowing down the subsequent decay. So you keep topping up, and you can see the curves are just gradually kind of flattening. We're all very familiar with flattening the curve now. This is flattening the curve in kind of a different way. We're trying to flatten that curve so that the memory is staying up there in the kind of 80, 90, 100% region, rather than decaying down to the 20, 30% region if there's nothing that you would do. Now, there's a lot of different literature and often some really quite complicated mathematical equations about exactly how much each review will slow the curve down by. But a kind of nice rule of thumb that I've taken from a few of the more practical applications of this is that if you do 7 consecutive correct reviews, and you do them spaced out in this way, so they're spaced out, so they're gradually increasing spacings, and I'll talk about that on the next slide, that if you do about 7 or 8 of those, you can get your recollection, your memory of it up to about 90%. So rather than having it decaying down to 30%, you can push that up to about 90% if you get about 7 or 8 recollections all spaced out, and that will then sustain over quite a long period of time too. So let's just have a little look about how this might work with some Shakespeare. So here, what you'll see, these blue bars are kind of the intervals, and you'll see that the intervals are gradually increasing in time. So this is what I mean about spaced repetition. You're spacing things out, and every time you get a question right, you then don't have to come back to it as frequently. And you can see the intervals are increasing here approximately kind of by 2.5 times. So let's have a look. Let's say you've got a fact about Shakespeare, comes up on your flashcard, you get it right. You come back after 10 minutes, you get it right. You come back after a day, you get it right. You come back after 3 days, you get it right. You then have to come back after 7 days. And then it's 17. And then the real genius of the spaced repetition is because these intervals keep increasing by 2.5 times, you very rapidly get to a point where you don't have to be reviewing it that often. And very rapidly that will get up to being months and years. So, but because you've been getting it right and you've been having that practice of recalling it, that's been strengthening the memory, you can still very rapidly get up to kind of 90% recall, even though after 7 or 8 repetitions, you're not going to be looking at it for months or even years. What about though, I've said here you're getting it right, what about if you're getting it wrong? Well, this is where kind of a personalized aspect comes into it. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about, well, some material maybe is just harder to memorize than others, and some people find certain material harder to memorize than others. That's absolutely right. So let's imagine you're memorizing a fact about Elizabeth I and you just find it a bit trickier and you get it right the first couple of times, but then you get to this point, you get it wrong. Well, then what happens with spaced repetition is it goes right back to the beginning. So you take it right back to the beginning and you set it at the start of the cycle again. So that's kind of how the spaced repetition is working. You're getting more practice on the cards that you struggle with, and the ones that you're really are flying away with, they will just, not have to come up that frequently. So you kind of won't have to almost, waste your time reviewing things that you have got locked down and you do know very, very well. So what's really clever about this is it's quite simple and efficient way of really building up that long-term memory. And it's taking advantage of some of these insights from Ebbinghaus that go back, as I say, over 100 years. Now, I've said here revise using a spaced repetition app. I haven't mentioned which spaced repetition app. Now, there are a number of different ones out there. There's some free, there's some that have subscriptions. I would say the one that I have used, and in the further reading here, I've got examples of people who use it. The one I use personally is one called Anki, and the 2.5, the multiply by 2.5 interval is one that I take from Anki. But Anki is not the only one out there. There is Quizlet, which I know is quite popular. Quizlet do have an interesting blog on their website about how they do spaced repetition, and that might be something to look at. But before you look at that, I think Quizlet is more student friendly. And there are other examples too. So this is not about me recommending a particular approach. There's also, in the further reading, I'll put a link to how you can create one, not using technology, just using a shoebox and flashcards. I must say, well, some people like that approach. I personally find it quite complex to stay on top of all of those. And to go back to my original point about technology, I really think this is an area where technology comes into its own, because I genuinely think this is the kind of thing, if you're managing a shoebox and potentially hundreds, and if you're doing it for years, potentially thousands of index cards, it can rapidly get quite unwieldy, and it can be pretty hard to kind of remember exactly how frequently you've got to be putting everything into the, the right sections of the shoebox. So for me, this is an area where technology really does come into its own. And to go back to what I said before, this is a way where you are using technology to, not to outsource memory, but to enhance it. And for me, that's where really the power of this lies. So yeah, I would say, you can have a look at the various different sort of apps out there and find one that maybe suits you and suits your purposes the most.